Today, I'm looking at something I did over last summer, converting a ready-to-run locomotive into a Caledonian Jumbo. Until very recently, Scottish pre-group modelers were fairly poorly served by the big manufacturers. And some of the things they did produce were eyebrow-raising, unfortunately, in terms of incorrect livery and bizarre choice of prototype. So for many, it was either go to kits or to convert. And this is a kind of last version of this idea of converting a ready-to-run locomotive into another prototype. The donor in this case was a Bachmann Southeastern and Chatham C-Class, designed by Wainwright round about the time that the Jumbos were current as well. The Jumbo, the Class 294, is quite distinct from the model produced recently by Rails of Sheffield and Bachmann. The Jumbo was built rather earlier, but there are many physical similarities. If you turn to Wikipedia, unfortunately, the writer did not know the difference and labels the 812 class as a Jumbo. Here is the Jumbo, and when you look at it in its heartland, or the Calais heartland in Lanarkshire amongst mineral trains, it's quite difficult at first sight to see the differences because the family resemblance is very strong. The easiest way to do it is to look for the footplate steps at the front. A Jumbo didn't have any, and standard goods, the Macintosh one, did. Jumbos were the largest class of locomotives built in Scotland by Scottish manufacturers. They were in two major batches. The 711s were really the larger boilered ones. The originals were often reboilered as well to make them more powerful when they went into St. Rollox. They were built mainly by Drummond when he arrived from the North British, but the design was carried on by his successors, Smiley, Lambie and Macintosh, till 1897, when Macintosh produced the more powerful standard goods. They were a fairly widespread class, but mainly they were used in goods traffic. Only 6 were in the blue livery, the rest were in the Calais black goods livery. They served all over the Calais system, and because of their lighter axle load, they could go on the more lightly laid lines such as the Callander and Oban. And of course, they served with the ROD in France in 1916, 17 and 18. So if that's your bent, there is scope there. They were a fairly robust class. All were taken over by the LNS, and all bar 6 survived into BR days. So again, were this class to be produced commercially, there are a number of liveries that would suit. They were withdrawn progressively in the 50s, and the last 4 went in 1963. Crucially, however, none were preserved. And that perhaps does explain why there has not been a ready-to-run model produced. Now, there is an alternative. Back in the 80s, DJ Itch produced a kit, and it's still in production 40 years later. It now costs 141 quid, but when you add in a motor and gearbox and wheels, you've no change from £300 odds. So it's a fairly expensive way to go about it. Still can be done, but expensive. If you're looking then for a donor, you need to get the drawings right to make sure that the original will fit. Now, in the 70s, Willie Stewart of the Glasgow and South Western Railway Society produced a large number of 4mm drawings for the railway modeler. And a large number of them were of Scottish prototypes. So here's one he did back in 1970 for the Jumbo. That's the original build with the safety valves on top of the dome. And the Calais reversing lever on the driver's side, which in this case was the left-hand side. The tender They were fitted with a number of tenders and quite often picked up second-hand tenders, but the one Willie drew is fortunately not unlike the one that the Cali used for 123, the racing locomotive of 1886, and one that Hornby did in fact model. So looking at the vital statistics, the Jumbo's wheel diameter was 5 foot, the wheelbase 16 foot 3, and crucially the gap between the wheels, which you don't often get on articles like Wikipedia. You have to go to the drawings, the wheelbase spacing there. The tender, fairly standard spacing, 6 foot 6 by 6 foot 6, and 4 foot tender wheels. Looking at the Southeastern and Chatham, the wheel diameter is 5 foot 2. Now in 4 mil, that is in fact less than a millimeter's difference. So that's okay. The wheelbase marginally longer, 1 millimeter longer. Again, I think that would fool the eye for most. The gap is slightly different, but again, it's only a couple of mils different, so probably many of us would live with that as well. The tender is identical with 6 foot 6 gaps between the wheels and 4 foot tender wheels. So it looks like a goer. So the raw materials, years ago at Model Rail, I picked up a 123 body and tender as spares. Got them for about £15. They don't necessarily match. The tender was slightly bashed about, but even so, beggars can't be choosers. Plasticard and Milliput can fix a number of sins. And here is the Bachmann, Southeastern and Chatham. Nice looking locomotive, absolutely delightful when it's in the original green livery. But you can pick these up. Again, the black ones are much cheaper second-hand on eBay than the green ones. And as it's getting butchered, you might as well go cheap. Now, the first job, in fact, was to separate the cab. And I used a slitter for this. And that possibly was my biggest single mistake. I should have used a razor saw to get verticals much more correct, and I should have left more of the footplate attached to the cab because it's not quite as tall as the Bachmann one. So that was a bit of a handicap, the very first thing I did. Now the cab was separated using a razor saw and prettied up, and it had to be butchered about quite a bit to separate it out. You can see the bits of the Cali one on the left with the interior cut out and the SECR one on the right with the spectacle plate about to be removed. So there, I went with the SECR spectacle plate because it fits the boiler and the boiler dimensions were very similar. It was quite tricky to contemplate replacing the boiler simply because the weighting for the locomotive is inside the boiler and it's a very tight fit. So the boiler stays, so the spectacle plate stayed with it. And you can see it looks a bit on the crude side, but as I say, Plasticard and Milliput can fix a variety of sins. Once you trial fit it, it doesn't look too bad at all, but you can see there is a telltale gap at the bottom of the cab, which was to give problems. The smoke box, again, detached, butchered off the front of the footplate on the 123 and slit behind the smoke box. Again, the razor saw gives you a good straight right angled cut. The smoke box wing plates will have to be filled out, but that is not a great problem. And you can see on the smoke box door and handle, fairly typical Masonic star that many Caledonian locomotives sported. Now, my second great problem was the footplate, because although locomotive engineers faced similar problems, they quite often came up with different solutions. In this case, Wainwright put the sandboxes on the center splasher rather than the front one, as was much more common. Now you can see in the bottom center that I started trying to saw this off with a slitting disc, with a razor saw, with you name it, but that metal is pretty tough. And you can see I got in about 1/4 of an inch. Then I discovered, by wrestling with it, that you could actually detach the splashers and other parts from the footplate with minimal force. They're lightly glued. So the simple solution was to swap the splashers round. But after very much angst, it was with a bit of relief that I went to do that. The wing plates, you can see, have been filled out there with very thin plastic card backed up with mulupat. And the part below the smoke box is from the original SECR part. Okay, and obviously a new chimney as well. The designs were quite different. This involved hacking off at as right angles a cut as you can the chimneys from both locomotives, tentatively putting the new funnel in place and then drilling a hole to take a brass rod to strengthen the whole assembly, and then filling in the gaps at the base with mulupat. The cab handrails at the back, and again, the old problem of the lack of depth in the cab sides came back to haunt. Various solutions, but none of them were sufficiently robust. To try and make the cab rails fit in place and stay there, I drilled them through the roof, because the Cali design is great for the drivers and crew, but not so great for modelling. They become detached almost at the blink of an eye. So drilling them through the roof seemed to be a much more permanent way of fixing them. The cab interior was rescued from the SECR. Took a fair bit of adjusting to get the centerpiece in, but it does look good. And you pretty well have to do this because the glazing for the spectacle plate is attached to that interior fitting. The splashers were refitted. You can see the one that was butchered in the bottom right has been filled in with mulupat, and the place where the Westinghouse bump has also been fitted in just in front of the center splasher. So a bit of a rescue job, really. And of course, if I was starting again, which I probably may, I'll know the pitfalls involved. Going now to the tender, the original fixes to the base of the chassis. The Caledonian one sits on top of the chassis. So there is a bit of adjustment and cutting to be done there. But again, with the right angle cuts made by the razor saw, this isn't as daunting as it may seem. So it involved cutting them into 3 parts each. On the left, the original ones from the Caledonian with the top of the tender, the main body of the tender, and the underpiece there, which would be discarded. The Southeastern and Chatham, the weight for the tender lies in the coal load. The tender itself is actually very light. The center part will be discarded and the base will be used to take on the Caledonian style tender. The tender will not be quite tall enough to match the one in Willie Stewart's drawing, so that would have to be heightened slightly. But you can see that in terms of dimensions, at least, the new Cali tender fits fairly snugly on top of the Wainwright chassis. And you can see some of the gubbins there, which I suspect are for things called chips or sound or whatever you very clever people do with your locos. Adding strengtheners and sticking them in place to hold the heightening bars. And again, just to make sure that things sit square and is robust enough, because it will get possibly damaged in handling. Originally, I only added the tender weight from the Wainwright one, and it's not quite big enough, or put it this way, I cut too big a hole in the original tender top. But again, plasticard and mulupat fill many, many sins. So there it is, disguised. The The heighteners there you can see fairly clearly in the white plastic card and at the front of the tender. The back of the coal area, there's a barrier there, stuck in place with the solvent and left to set overnight, held in place by trusty rubber bands. You can see that I had to add new sides to the tender doors, and however, looking, promising. But the taste, of course, is when you stick on some primer. And there you find that things are not quite as hoped, that the filler isn't as smooth, and I had to go away, refill and reprime again. The tender fixing points, there are three, two at the front, which are fine. They fit the original tender base. And the one at the back, I tried to get a fixing point in the Cali chassis. Thought I'd managed it until the next time I took it apart. So that wasn't a success. But the front two screws will hold it. The third one is built-in braces. On now to painting and the various bits and pieces. I've called a halt. I've accepted that the splashers aren't quite as aligned as I would have liked, but I was getting a bit scunnered, to be honest, and decided to live with it. The handrails are brass because nothing quite looks as much like brass as brass itself. I covered them with Mascol for the priming. I decided to live with the Wainwright dome instead of putting a Drummond one on, because the similarities are quite significant. The differences are minimal. And there we have a trial fit on the chassis and starting to look reasonably like a Jumbo. At the front, I decided to put on Cali buffers, of which I had some in the spares box. So removed the Wainwright ones, sanded it flat, and then fixed the new buffers. So once it's primed and painted, and it's a nice simple job painting things black, it's on to the lining. Now, unfortunately, the kind of go-to suppliers, Fox, although they do black and white livery for passenger locos, the nearest they have for the goods loco is the BR grey and white, and it doesn't quite look the same. Now, the alternative of doing it yourself using two separate sets of transfers is time consuming and very trying as far as one's self-control and patience go. I decided to do the outer bits first because you can always put stuff inside an outer line. It's sometimes difficult to put stuff outside an inner line. So the red I did first on the tender, and then started adding the black into the white interior lines as I went. I did the reverse in some ways with the Loco, covered the cab with the red lining as per the tender, but because the boiler lining is red, white, red, I did the centerpieces in white. And once I'd done the first set of linings from transfers, I gave it a light spray with clear varnish. Unfortunately, that didn't do the painted number plate any good. And perhaps it would have been better added after all the varnishing was done. Now, the close-ups are fairly cruel in terms of alignment, but I do promise you at a greater distance and in motion, you won't notice quite the same, the little blemishes and imperfections. And again, the varnishing, once this is done, holds everything in place. If you don't varnish between the two coats of transfers, the first lot will be lifted when you do the second one. It's, as I say, a very time-consuming job. The tools I use are a cocktail stick, a fine brush, and bits of water, occasionally cotton buds, but infinite patience. Unfortunately, the white transfers, nor the red ones, in fact, didn't really come in curves. So I had to cheat by cutting very short lengths and then assembling them on the splashers, for example. Again, that is fairly hard going. You can see the imperfections close up, but perhaps from a distance, it's not quite so bad. The Loco Crew I bought from Hardy's. They come in sets of 8. They're those printed ones, 3D printed ones. 8 for 18 quid, I thought was worth it. The poses are unique and the detail is tremendous. So at £3 odds a figure, a fairly good buy, I think, and certainly compared to the price of metal crews. There we go with the crew in, the locos lined, the varnishings on, and again, from a distance, the blemishes in the lining don't look quite so great. And you can see at the front of the Loco, the Cali buffers flat against the front, the tender bar. Okay, so there we go. It's assembled, it's ready to run. Now, just before we go to the running, the Family Resemblances. The one I built is the center one, and the one in the front is the Bachmann Rails one, the 812 class, which is bigger. And of course, you can see the steps on the Loco footplate. The Loco at the back is a DJH kit built 30, 40 years ago, when not long after they first came out. And there it has the original layout with the safety valves on top of the dome. Okay, thus encouraged, I bought another SECR because I have another set of spares. So sometime over the next year, I will be doing another one. Okay, here we go, the Jumbo at work. Hadn't been out in the garage for some time, so some of the figures are a bit awry, but here we go. So with a train of mineral empties, and you don't notice the lining imperfections at that speed. And same shot again, and the view of the crew this time hard at work. And again, a third view, very similar. I was starting to enjoy myself. And at eye level, I think, quite a reasonable representation. Now, in reverse, did it run? Well, it did. It ran just as well, and didn't bother. I wasn't too bothered by the fairly crude Hornby points. However, what the Jumbo was designed to pull were long mineral trains, and you'll see one coming through. This is the 828 with a passenger train, but the Jumbo coming through with some 30-ton wagons designed by Macintosh for mineral traffic. Now, those are fairly light and had to be weighted by plasticine because good break there was one built from a Cali Coaches kit, and it is quite weighty. So if you don't weight the bogie wagons, they tend to get pulled off. Similar shot again. I thought I was home free, but you'll notice that when the Jumbo comes over some of the diamond crossings, the tender gets dislodged slightly. So that's partly a function of the insufficient weight I put in it. You can see it rattling over the crossings there. Now, I did subsequently re-weight the tender, but the trouble is, because the layout's on the slightest of gradients, it now struggles pulling the weighted mineral wagons. But hey-ho, that's how things go. And lastly, moving some empty coaches. These are actually the Hatton's Genesis ones for the London and North Western. But at this distance, the liveries are very, very similar to the Calais. Okay, in summary, well, the cost, as I've said, the Wainwright cost just over 80 quid on eBay with about a £5 for postage and tacking. The body and tender picked up at Model Rail over the last 20, 30 years for fairly insignificant sums now. The whistle was a market and the transfers come from Fox at about a £5 a sheet. Hardy's Hobbies do a lovely set of 8 steam Loco Crew for 18 quid. Very, very high quality. Can't recommend them enough. I tend to use Army Painter with the black primer, which actually did as the top coat with an Army Painter satin varnish on top of that. And other things, of course, from the spares box, like the buffers. In time, it took over 2 months, but that wasn't 2 months hard at it, because for most of the time, my wife was in hospital with a broken hip. So this was kind of very much off-on modelling, but there was a fair bit of drying time involved in terms of plastic glue and others. And it also gave me thinking time when I was wondering what to do with the splashers. And eventually I came to a conclusion. Was it worthwhile? Well, yes, you get modern, ready-to-run reliability, and you get an 060, which will actually cope with relatively tight curves, radius 2, occasionally radius 1, which kit-built locomotives will not do. Lessons learned. Yes, plenty. The old one. If you're keeping screws, put them in a poly bag and label them, because the time you can spend crawling around the floor before you find them is time wasted. The razor saw with a mitre is very much the way to go when you're cutting sections. The Bachmann locos are relatively robust, but you can, with a fair bit of pressure from fingers and thumbs, detach bits that look at first glance as if they're fixed or part of the casting. The splashers were, as I say, a bit of a nightmare. And again, if you are having to cut them, do it very sparingly and only to make sure they fit in their new positions square on. Die cast metal is jolly tough indeed. Shortening the smoke box would help a wee bit because the handrails do sit slightly proud. I decided to go with the original Bachmann handrails simply because I am absolutely rubbish at bending brass wire into the shapes necessary to replace them. The original mistake, the very first thing I did was wrong. So again, that would be something to do for the next time. Again, you are handling the loco when you're putting in the crew. You don't want lining freshly fixed to come off in your thumbs. So once you've done lining, yeah. And again, the number plate after varnishing. You could get away with not heightening the tender because there were other Calais tenders that weren't quite so high. Although I think it does look quite the part as it is. And again, you could lengthen the tender slightly because the toolbox at the rear wasn't universal. I did put extra weight in the tender to help with running. In the event, I probably put in too much. I was using old white metal from the days when I used to cast model soldiers. And the blue tack and mascal on the loco spectacles, because if you put the varnish on the glass, it does frost over and spoils the looks. Bitter experience talking. And again, when you're putting it in its keeper box, remember that if you've put on a taller chimney, you will have to adjust the fittings in the box. Again, you can learn that lesson the hard way. Some useful addresses. There's a book on the Jumbos produced by the Caledonian Railway Society. It was on sale at Model Rail a couple of months ago. If you want details or have questions, the website of the Caledonian Association, you get some really, really helpful hints and advice and information on that. You can also contact Jim Smiley at Cali Coaches. You'll find him always willing to help. And in fact, it was he who supplied the drawings that Willie Stewart did. In terms of the paint and varnish, as I say, do like Army Painter. It comes out in a fine spray and the quality is good. Transfers, Fox transfers as before, and Hardy's Hobbies for the footplate crew. Again, great figures. In terms of accessories, you can get things from markets and others, and from Alan Gibson as well. And that's it, guys. That's it.